Great. Welcome to the Summer of Open Data. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and I'm delighted to introduce this first ever kickoff call of the Summer of Open. The Summer of Open Data is a 3-month series of conversations with key stakeholders, key experts, key players in the data community worldwide. And we hope through those conversations to really get a sense of what's the current state of open data, and more importantly, how do we move forward? How do we instigate what we call a third wave of open data that specifically focuses on broadening open data at the subnational level, trying to establish also new data collaboratives that can unlock data that typically resides in the private sector, but more importantly, doing all of this while having a data responsibility framework that also instills trust in how the data is being shared, but also being used. And so today, as I mentioned, we have the kickoff call, and we have the 3 partners that are behind the Summer of Open Data, which includes BrightHive, Open Data Charter, and the Open Data Institute. And we have a stellar panel with all of the leaders of those stellar organizations that will reflect on some of the questions that I've just initiated with regard to the state of open data and how to move forward. Without me introducing them, I will ask each of the partners to introduce her or himself, and starting off with Jeni. Everyone knows Jeni, but Jeni, perhaps you can still introduce yourself on who you are, where you're based, and what you're trying to do if you're not on Zoom calls.
Thanks, Stefan. So I'm Jeni Tennison. I'm the Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute, which is a not-for-profit based in the UK that works with companies and governments to build an open and trustworthy data ecosystem. And when I'm not on Zoom calls, then I'm trying to write and think about it. And sometimes I even get to do a little bit of coding myself and play with data, which is what I really enjoy.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jeni. Ania.
Thank you, Stefan. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with esteemed colleagues to launch this exciting initiative. I am Ania Calderon, and I head the Open Data Charter, which is a global collaboration of over 100 governments and organizations that are working together to collect, share, and use data to address targeted policy challenges. We do this by developing practical guidance to open up data in ways that can deliver tangible benefits to people, and believe that this can only be achieved by governing data inclusively and accountably. And I'm based in London.
Great. Thanks so much, Ania. And Matt.
Hi, so I'm Matt Gee. I'm the co-founder and CEO of BrightHive, which is a public benefit corporation that supports the design, development, and management of data collaboratives. And I'm also a Data and Society Fellow at the UChicago Knowledge Lab, which allows me to scratch the research itch that I always have. So really, really glad to be on this panel, and glad to be a partner.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks, Ania. Thanks, Jeni. As you can see, we have I would say, probably the best panel ever that can reflect on the state of open data and how to move forward. So I'm delighted to be able to at least pose a few questions. And so without further ado, let's go and delve into some of the issues that at least are on my top of mind list with regard to open data. And let's start with Jeni, and especially Jeni, we've made a great progress at the national level, and I would like to get also your assessment on how you're doing there. But clearly, different patterns and different developments have emerged at the local level. And so what I would really like to know from you, Jeni, especially given your work at the Open Data Institute, what's the current state of play of open data at the national versus the local level? Do we see differences? And if so, how can we address them?
So those are good questions, and I think that the play and interplay between national and local level is one of the things that is a thing to work out through this kind of third wave. So, you know, if I can just touch at the kind of national to local piece, because this is one of the things that has come up a lot during the COVID-19 crisis. I think we have to recognize that data that is held at the national level is incredibly useful at the local level. And when it isn't being made available to the local level, you're actually holding back local level decision makers from being able to do what they need to do. And that can play in terms of not having the right kind of disaggregation to local level, to the right kind of level of granularity for local decision making. Or it can play in terms of the kind of priorities at the national level about what gets collected and what gets shared back down to that local level. And so there's a real interplay, particularly when it's that the data is actually being gathered at the local level, reported back up to the national level, and then never seen again, right? So for me, it's those part of the picture is these flows from local to national, from national back down to local. How is the national convening power and ability to put together data from across a nation actually helping to support local decision makers? So that's one big theme that I think that we need to really unpack and get better at in the future. The other one is about local level kind of agency and control over what data they can collect and use at that local level for their local aims and things. So for example, we did some work a couple of years ago looking in particular at peer-to-peer accommodation, and the role of peer-to-peer accommodation is different in different places. In some places then Airbnb, for example, is going to have a big impact on your tourism industry. In other places, then it's all about business people who might be coming and using that kind of accommodation. And so the urgency of collecting data about that, of being able to understand it, of being able to map it into the local context, is very much a custom thing, right? In some places, peer-to-peer accommodation is the least of your worries. You're much more concerned about, say, exactly what the transport situation is in your area. And so devolution and giving cities and local areas controls over what data they can collect, in particular when we start looking at these relationships with the private sector and private sector actors in those local areas, is another big theme that I think we need to talk about, discuss, carry through over the next few years.
Great, thanks so much, Jeni. And have you seen any interesting practices emerging from this kind of local agency, and how it then also translate into different kinds of priorities as it relates to data vis-a-vis the national level, for instance?
I mean, I have to say that the local area where I've been most familiar with is what's going on within London, where I think we're seeing some interesting interplays between private sector and public sector. In part, private sector picking up the baton of trying to help make London a good place to live, and in part London as a collection of boroughs, because that's another really interesting thing. You know, you have different levels of granularity here, and different levels of convening, and needing to are actually wanting to get hold of that kind of private sector data, and looking at the kinds of powers that they can have to do that. The other kinds of things that we've been doing at ODI around local authority data is being engaged in a number of stimulus funds to help local authorities to have a little bit of space and time to think through their own uses of data. And we're seeing there the same things as we see at the kind of national level of, for example, wanting to bring together data sets in order to help target vulnerable consumers, so that they know where to, you know, where they need to put the most help and support at that kind of at that local space, and looking at how they can work more effectively with local businesses, local universities, to really get the best out of the research that goes on there.
Cool, great. Ania, one of the issues that quite often didn't get much attention at the initial stages of what we call the second wave of open data, where actually more and more governments were thinking about unlocking some of the data assets, was of course, how do you do this in a manner that also adheres with notions of data responsibility, data governance, and so on. And so a clear emerging priority of the open data movement the last few years have been, how do you provide access and how do you reuse data in a manner that also is trustworthy and also adheres to some notions of equity and other principles that are important to advance. So Ania, how do you feel and how do you see this data governance and data responsibility agenda emerging, and how does it match with the open data kind of agenda in general moving forward?
Yes, Stefan, I would perhaps want to challenge this statement, because I don't think necessarily that the open data field was oblivious to issues of responsibility, for example, in terms of privacy and security at the beginning. Data that was deemed to violate issues of privacy or could potentially lead to security concerns were always considered as things that should not be covered under open data. But I think what has changed is our understanding of what types of information can be used to identify, re-identify, or even serve as proxies to target individuals and potentially cause harm around that. And in that way, you are right. I think that the open data community has not sufficiently balanced its arguments for publishing information against these fast evolving data rights and advancements in technology. I think a recent piece called The Data Delusion by Martin Teesney was really helpful in outlining these things, where he mentions people are impacted by data that is not personal and by personal data that is not about them. So this makes the imperative of addressing the twin goals of access to information and data protection in ways that are ethical and responsible even more nuanced. It is no longer a binary issue, and therefore we need to give more thought to the many gradients in between. And to your point, I think in order to make progress, one of the things we're thinking about at the Open Data Charter is the need to re-articulate what we mean by open by default, one of the core principles of the Open Data Charter, and which is why I think this initiative to define the third wave of open data is so important. And it's about an understanding that it is as important for the process of making data available to others to be rooted in principles of openness as much as the data as a product. So I think if we flip our thinking about trust, because it's not the data we should trust, but rather the systems and practices that are enabling that data to be accessible. This means open and honest communication about data that's being published. We're increasingly seeing how important that is around the COVID-19 crisis context. For example, having more transparency about how data is being structured, who is making those decisions, what limitations we perhaps need to be made aware of, as well as explaining how sensitive and personal information is being dealt with, for example, by publishing any privacy or other risk assessment impacts in timely and meaningful ways that is allowing for public scrutiny to happen. And throughout this process, I think a key component is establishing engagement channels with people that may be potentially affected or that may want to use this data in order to create value and learn from the ways that it's being used. So I think, as we're seeing COVID-19 crisis exposing many fault lines in terms of our political and social balance, I think what's also being increasingly exposed is a very fragmented data ecosystem. And Jeni already mentioned a bit of that fragmentation across national and local boundaries, but this is making collaboration extremely difficult. So I think it is crucial that we take the learnings from our current context to understand how both open and sharing data in ways that are responsible and ethical are so critical for helping us navigate this pandemic, but also thinking about the process in a way that is establishing notions that you've established from the start in terms of this third wave around collaboration, around building trust. And essentially, I would perhaps push us further to think about what may be helpful in this third wave is a lens or an approach, a feminist approach to open data that allows for engagement with the politics of the production of data from a standpoint of people and communities that historically have not held positions of power and can help us reveal configurations of interest and agency that contextualize the data.
Great. Cool. Well, eager to unpack that eventually. But let me go straight to Matt. And Ania actually already alluded to the importance of collaboration. And of course, one of the ways to collaborate, it's not the only way, is through data collaboratives, which is one of those areas that you have worked on a lot, where on the one hand, the demand side meets the supply side of data, combined with the expertise to generate insight of the data, and that ultimately is one model to perhaps both accelerate access to data, but also accelerate trust in how it is being done to a large extent. So eager to hear from you, Matt. What's the current state of data collaboration? Is this part of this third wave where we see not just opening up data, but also generating more collaborative arrangements in order to really generate insight that can help people's lives?
Sure. So I won't bear the lead. I think it is. I think this is data collaboration as and data collaboratives as a model for the third wave. They're a part of the third wave of the open data movement. I think feels right with what I see and what I think a lot of other folks looking at the ecosystem are seeing. And I think there's a lot of innovation along three different dimensions that are proving this out. You sometimes hear the appetizing acronym, the BLT sandwich of trusted data collaboration, that you need business alignment, legal framework, and technical infrastructure. And I think we spend a lot of time, or at least there's a lot of airplay given to a lot of the technical innovations and blockchain this and that. But I think the thing that's really exciting is that you've seen over the last several years innovation along each of those three key dimensions in that BLT sandwich. So technical, obviously, we've seen some of the most promising privacy tech, make the transition from academic papers into production deployments in government and industry, from differential privacy and secure multi-party computation to newer things like federated learning and trusted execution environments, and those lower the risks for different modalities of data collaboration. You're also seeing a lot of great innovation and progress in digital identity and ownership with things like World Wide Web Consortium's distributed identifiers and verifiable credential specifications. And you're seeing the standards community really take old tooling from the original kind of semantic web thinking and repurpose it for cross-enterprise and cross-organizational data collaboration in more trusted environments. So you see things like the Trust Over IP Foundation, which is a new Linux Foundation project focused entirely on that. How do we take semantic web technologies and some of this new identity and privacy preserving tech, and add a meaningful trust layer on top of data that allows for a lot more modalities for collaboration. So I think from a technical standpoint, there's lots of advancement that are allowing data collaboratives as a category to really proliferate. But it's not just happening there, it's happening in the legal realm as well. Some of this is regulatory, right? So you got the great forcing function of things like GDPR and CCPA, and there are many, many children that are forcing both the enterprise and academia to think about ways of about legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks around data. But you're also seeing kind of a lot of experimentation and emergence of contractual frameworks, data trusts, data commons, data unions. And last year, you're seeing actually this really interesting blend of legal innovations and technical innovations coming together around contractual infrastructure. So things like the Accord project for non-blockchain based smart contracts that are making data collaboration a lot more functional. But I think those two things I really feel are actually less important than the biggest dimension of innovation, which is business model innovation. Right? The private sector, especially, if we want to get them thinking about beneficial use of data and doing it, there's got to be a lot more business model innovation and transitions within the public and private sector around data culture in order to really make data collaboratives functional. And you see this, private sector isn't used to open data models, frankly. They have an extractive culture around data, and business models are built with that in mind. So you're seeing increasingly, though, a lot more of the private sector thinking about data philanthropy. So data as a good that's part of their CSR work. You're seeing data joint ventures as new business models. You're seeing kind of more clever incentivized networks and transitions of core business models into that are centered on an open data ecosystem. So I think all three of those things are happening right now, and I think are pretty exciting to watch and be part of.
Great. Wow. I think we just got, anyway, Jeni, Ania, and Matt gave us like the crash course in the current state of thinking with regard to open data and data collaboratives, which is brilliant. And I do have to say, Matt, I do have a problem with the BLT being a vegan, so we're going to have to come up with a different way of actually explaining what this is all about, perhaps a hummus sandwich or something like that. But then anyway, what would be the H? I don't know what that would look like. But let me go to the other big element of the third wave of open data that we are interested in, which is also this shift of thinking. And again, this is not happening now. This has been in the process for a few years. The shift of thinking of really pushing data out to pushing data with a purpose, and again, publish with a purpose, which is of course something that the Open Data Charter has been working on a lot. And so I go straight to Ania to really get your sense of, well, first of all, to explain what do you mean by publish with purpose? And then also, have you seen any interesting developments? And of course, you are part of probably a few of those where we have seen far more experimentation with actually the concept of publish with purpose that then also can scale at different levels, both at the local level, for instance, but also engaging private sector with regard to publish with purpose around their data, for instance. Ania.
Yes, well, at the Open Data Charter, we advocate for governments to focus their publishing data publishing efforts to be guided by purpose. And what we mean by that is really acknowledging that context really matters. We don't treat health data the same as we do transport data or data from the judiciary system, for example. And this is because there's essentially different levels of risk involved. Those that are deemed low risk should perhaps be made open by default, while others require more degrees of safeguarding. People may feel comfortable with certain types of data being shared for certain purposes and not others. And in cases, for example, of data about those in positions of power, such as expenses from public officials, there are laws that require that information to be made available, and some sort of redressing power mechanism. And I think this is fundamentally important because as humans, we experience the world through problems and not data. So engaging people around problems makes a lot more sense than trying to engage them about, potential data that they wouldn't know how to connect to their daily experiences. So what I have found helpful also in thinking around purpose and value has been a recent report from Nature that's pointing to or acknowledging a common and popular focus from the AI, but also more broadly the tech industry, to ask whether tools are fair or for good. And I think that in thinking about purpose, we aim to go beyond that, because these are what have been called sort of catch-all terms. And in that way, it is important to think not only about purpose, but also about data, about, for example, how data might be shifting power. So the notion of power, I think, is one that we need to do more in terms of understanding how it revolves around the decisions that are made around data availability. And the focus of this piece basically was calling for putting marginalized and impacted communities at the center of that design, development and governance practices that I think data ecosystems and building data infrastructures can greatly benefit from. So along with thinking of problems, where I think work that the GovLab, for example, has done around the 100 questions has been really helpful to start with, clearly articulating what issue you're trying to address that is connecting to a community of potential users or people invested in that issue. That can potentially include people from government, civil society organizations, but also the private sector, will lead to a much more engaged process. So, in this sense, examples around this, I think in our current context for COVID-19 have abound. We've been efforts in collaboration with the OECD. We've called for governments and have partnered with governments from different places to develop meetups that basically are engaging communities around getting their feedback in terms of what data do they want to have more access to for particular issues, and that being used to inform their data publication processes. So I think that when you have a case where there's a clearly established goal, that's a shared goal by several different stakeholders, there's the potential for creating more accessibility and trust around that data that's being released around it.
Great. Thanks so much. Jeni, any experiences from your end on how you can engage, for instance, citizens also more in really defining the purpose or defining what are certain areas where data can add value to some of the indicators that they care about?
So I think that our experience on this has really been about traveling from the world where governments were publishing data just because it was the low-hanging fruit, and that sometimes that not giving us the real benefits that we wanted to see, and then needing to prioritize their efforts into, you know, improving access around particular data sets, because they can't do everything, right? Through to then realizing that organizations can use the availability of data to actually change the way the ecosystems work, change the way that they function. So a few examples of that I like to use. So one is the work that we've been doing recently with Welcome, where we've really looked at across the world where there are health related issues and where data could actually make an impact, and in particular data innovation could actually have an impact in addressing those health related issues. So for example, we eventually narrowed down on things like snake bite, on things like drug resistant infections, on things like mental health issues, but even further down into who is it that needs to be making a decision off this data. What data do they need in order to make those decisions more rapidly or more accurately, so that we were concentrating on the right things rather than just on what was there, what was needed. Another example that I like to use is one with, again, a big program that we've been involved in called Open Active, where the purpose is we need to get more people more active. And one of the gaps, it's not the only thing, but one of the things that stops people from being active is not having information about where they can go to classes. And so making that information available more readily, not only on apps, but also in doctors' surgeries, right, is the way of shifting at least that part of the behavior change that you want to see. So there it's a much broader set of people that you're talking about, and it's really about where is information the gap that is preventing a beneficial behavior change within the system. And then the third example that I like to use is the one that we've seen in the UK, where the government insisted that retailers report and that they would publish the number of plastic bags that were being used, and they needed to report it because they needed to charge for it. But actually the reporting in and of itself, in much the same way as pay gap reporting in and of itself, is a way of driving change in the system. So not because it informs new decisions, but because being forced to be public about what it is that's going on is one of the ways in which to change motivations. So for me then the like publish with purpose, or taking a really purpose oriented view is in part about thinking about what kinds of decisions need to be made by whom in order to get change in this space, and then thinking about data not only as an input to those decisions, but also as a kind of tool for making those decisions work in a little bit of a different way.
Cool. So Matt, going to you and posing basically the same type of question, which is, of course, if you are instigating data collaboratives, which is what BrightHive is excellent at. What drives the data collaborative? I mean, how do you and who is developing the purpose behind it, and how does it get updated? Because I think a part of the lesson learned from what Ania and Jeni says is that the purpose might change also over time, and then once you have new kinds of decisions that actually were informed by the data initially, how do you keep that kind of purpose-driven approach?
Yeah, I think what both of them said beautifully. You have to, purpose has to be the rallying cry, not the afterthought, right? And I think, if there are early faults to the open data movement, I think a lot of us were saw what could be done and kind of led with the open story and said the purpose will follow. And I think that doesn't, one of the things we've learned in working with a lot of these collaboratives is that that just saying, hey, there's a lot of potential here if you guys can just collaborate is insufficient to get organizations to commit resources to doing it, to commit time, to take on the risks of creating new data workflows and publishing new data out. And so you have to anchor from the very beginning. You have to do that discovery and design process with those organizations, with the community members, to really anchor to what that initial golden use case is, right? That aligns everyone's interests to say, yes, that's valuable enough to me and to you and to these other people that we want to help. And I think it matters a lot whose voices are at the table in that initial discussion. I think one of the areas that we can all do better at is to figure out how to expand the size of that starting table. And then the second thing we've observed to your point is that it's a set of dominoes. You need the first one to fall. It's the hardest, but after that, the organizations that have come together, whether they're several public agencies, with one data collaborative that we've done with the state of Colorado, they had one initial purpose, and it was just, we want to measure the return on investment for public investments and training and education. But since then, in going through and flexing the muscles that it took to just get to that one shared purpose across agencies, the uses have and the goals have proliferated. The purposes that they've realized they can accomplish together have grown. So I think, making sure that we develop models that allow for that kind of land and expand for the purposes are incredibly important. That they have the legal flexibility, the governance flexibility for folks to discover new purposes and walk through the socialization to get there. The last thing I'll kind of share along, pulling on this thread is, I think to Jenny's point, I think we're now moving into a really important phase for open data, where we have to go beyond just like national or state level mandates that thou shalt publish things to a portal. And it's time for us open data advocates to partner with and show up in discussions with domain experts that really understand a particular ecosystem, a particular use case, and where they can be the evangelists for articulating the specific use case in their ecosystem for open data. And a excellent example of this that I saw play out over the last 6 months was an ecosystem that had come together, something called the T3 Innovation Network, which was a bunch of public and private parties trying to figure out how to make data across education and the workplace more interoperable and more open. And they had done 6 months of work really trying to get specific about what those use cases were and what was necessary to make it happen. And this was well before COVID-19 hit and kind of the needs around data, especially for reskilling and retooling, happened. But because they had done that work, and because there were both open data advocates in that community and folks who really understood that ecosystem at a very deep level, when it hit, and when several federal agencies called up and said, hey, we're putting together legislation for this, for a response to the CARES, this CARES Act, for response to the crisis, what should we put in there about data? They had very specific language for that ecosystem. And so they were able to do the, open data lobbying in some ways for open data language in the CARES Act that now is incentivizing every state in the United States to publish their workforce programs and credentials and the skills that people can learn as open linked data. And that language is in the grant requirements. And it took that kind of preparatory work by the combination of the open data community and that education and training community to come together to be ready for that moment. So I think that I totally agree with Jenny's assessment. That's where we've got to do a lot more of that kind of work.
Cool, great, and excellent input. And also, as I said, this is a kickoff call of the summer of open data, especially focusing on what are the contours of the third wave of open data. And I think we already actually got a really rich discussion on what are those contours, ranging from the tension between national and local to data responsibility to ultimately new kinds of data collaborations in a responsible manner that are all purpose driven. And the last question, because I don't want to have this kickoff, I could have this kickoff call last a day, of course, but I don't think Ania and Jeni, especially given the fact that it's already late in London, would appreciate that. So the last question to all of you, and I will start with Ania to answer, is given the fact that we know the contours of the third wave of open data, we know to a large extent what are, based upon the tremendous lessons learned and also the tremendous progress made of the last few years with regard to open data, we know how to move forward to a large extent. What stands in the way? And what is one key element that you feel stands in the way, and how can we collectively, because part of this summer of open data is also to have the ecosystem collectively reflect on how can we make progress with regard to the third wave of open data. Ania, you're the first, and then Jeni, and then Matt can close off this kickoff call to really reflect on what stands in the way, and is there anything that as a ecosystem, as a collective, we can join forces.
So I think something that is standing in the way currently is that our legislation and policies are insufficient to respond to the nuances we're seeing in terms of how data is being used, abused, or not being able to access for informing key policy decisions, for example. So as these are developed and we're designing or imagining new frameworks as well as institutions, I think we can really look at examples. I mean, what Matt was mentioning already around data trusts or other types of collaboratives to ensure that information is fairly distributed in ways that are inclusive and trustworthy. But we really need for a legislative framework to guide a vision, and then that to be grounded in specific policies, practices, capacities, resources being invested around it. Some will probably require more sort of specific legislation on making data available, for example, especially those around imbalances of power. Jeni already mentioned, I think, a great one where we're doing a lot of work in terms of access to gender pay data. But others such as beneficial ownership, transparency in political campaigning, and thinking well beyond just, what is that type of data that can help enhance public value or social well-being, into also thinking how can we sustain a healthier public debate based on a shared reality with shared information that people can have access to, that I think we ultimately need to improve trust and contribute to well-functioning democratic system.
Great. Jeni?
So mine's a bit of a challenging one for those of us, I think, that work across the data spectrum, that don't just look at open data, but also look at the kind of nuances of sharing data in ways that can't be open. So what I've seen over the last few years, and it's reflected in the way in which we talk about data collaboratives and data trusts and data institutions here at ODI as well, is that we're getting more used to talking about those nuances, that some data can be more accessible but not entirely open, that we might want to in order to, you know, really get the commercial organizations in the game, we might need to make sure that some of their commercial interests are also protected, or that we start getting really worried about kind of how responsible are we about making sure that this data doesn't get into the hands of any bad guys. All of this nuance then means that we forget the real power of open, and what open data, as in you know, machine readable with an open license, that means that you can bring it together with other data that is also openly licensed without having to worry about all of the legal constraints around it, that mean that data can be combined with other data in incredibly flexible network ways that give us real added value. If we lose ourselves in the nuance, I'm worried we will lose ourselves in our understanding of the real benefit of actual open data, of those actual open licenses, of not having that nuance, of going to that extreme, if you like. So for me, it's not really a barrier. It's just a kind of alert in my head that I think it's absolutely right, and you know, we do it a lot. It's about talking about those nuances of making data as open as possible, but we also really need to just hold on to the fact that sometimes open is what we really need, and fully open data is what is actually needed here.
Great, that's brilliant. Matt,
you
have the last word here.
Oh goodness, this has been such a pleasure just to learn from everyone on this call. I love Jenny's point about default to open, that period, right? When I think of barriers, I think that the biggest barrier is actually data culture, frankly. In government, often it's a zero-sum data culture. If I give you my data, then I lose power. In corporations, it's an extractive data culture. Every corporation has been sold by some consultant or an article in The Economist saying that they should orient to their data the way that oligopolies orient to oil, and that's a bad metaphor. And I think, unfortunately, for individuals, for too many individuals, the data culture is resignation, right? Feeling powerless to change the fundamentals of the data economy. So I think when I look at barriers, I think figuring out how we en masse, shift data culture and not just kind of demonstrate possibility, I think is really key. And when I think of enabling factors, the biggest enabling factor, at least by my count, is demand, right? Demand is the biggest driver for collaboration. Demand is the thing that moves politicians, it moves markets. So I think if we can understand those real drivers of demand for open data, engage with communities to understand them better, and give those demand drivers both kind of voice and market signal, then we can get faster to a place where we default to open.
Wonderful. That was brilliant. I couldn't think of a better kickoff session here to really go deep into what the contours of the third wave of open data might be. Jeni, Ania, Matt, thanks so much for joining, but also thanks so much for being partner of this Summer of Open Data. We have 3 more months to go. And so I think many of the issues that we've raised, we will hope to go deeper and touch upon in the next series of panels. So stay tuned, and thanks again for joining.